Hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining our TRED Talk this evening. I am Jessica Carlsruhe, Executive Director of TRED Coalition. I'm a sixth-generation Texan and truly honored to be serving the citizens of Texas by helping advocate for and protect private property rights. For those of you who aren't familiar with TRED, the acronym stands for the Texas Real Estate Advocacy and Defense Coalition. We are a statewide, nonpartisan, member-based organization that educates, advocates for, and defends property rights at the state and local levels. TRED Talks is our newest educational programming, connecting landowners, experts, legislators, and the general public on issues affecting rural landowners across the state. Our programming covers issues like eminent domain, conservation, ranching, various industries in Texas, property rights, and water, which brings us to tonight's discussion on the relationship of water and land in the state. For this evening, we've partnered with the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance on this discussion. So I'll start by introducing their executive director, who will then introduce tonight's speaker, Char Miller. Annalisa Peace is the executive director of the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance, which unites 52 organizations throughout a 21-county region in Central and South Texas behind a plan to protect the Edwards and Trinity aquifers, their contributing watersheds in the Texas Hill Country. Annalisa holds an MS in Urban Administration from Trinity University and has more than 30 years experience working with government and nonprofit organizations in various capacities. It is a pleasure to be partnering with you on advocacy and education opportunities such as this event. So thank you so much for co-hosting tonight's TRED Talk, Annalisa.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, it's delightful. This is the first of a lot of future partnerships, I hope, with TRED because our missions are so synonymous. Yeah, so it brings me great pleasure to introduce Char Miller. He's the W.M. Keck Professor of Environmental Analysis and History at Sonoma College and was formerly faculty at Trinity University in its History and Urban Studies programs. He has written extensively about San Antonio in such books as San Antonio, A Tricentennial History, On the Edge, Water, Immigration, and Politics in the Southwest, Deep in the Heart of San Antonio, Land Life in South Texas, San Antonio and Environmental History, and forthcoming in 2021 is West Side Rising, How San Antonio's 1921 flood destroyed a city and sparked Latino environmental justice movement. Char served on San Antonio's Open Space Advisory Council and Tree Preservation Ordinance Committee and worked closely with the Whitty Museum's many exhibits about land and water in South Texas. Although he now lives in Southern California, he remains a dyed-in-wool Spurs fan. And Char, you have so many fans here in the Central Texas region. So we're really delighted to have you. Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for this chance to talk to whoever's out there in Zoom land and have a chance to talk about a landscape that we all love, the Edwards Plateau, the Balcones Escarpment, and all of the rivers and springs that sort of make up this remarkable resource. Let me share my screen. Ooh, where did it go? There we go. And hold on one second, folks. All right, can everyone see that? We're good? Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do today, in large measure because of what GEAA and TRED stand for, is to use the Edwards Plateau, the escarpment, the rivers, springs, and these extraordinary natural resources to talk about the pressures on this landscape, both contemporary and past. And actually, there's a way in which these things are deeply connected with one another, as I'll show you. But I want to start with how we think about space. So let's take this map here of the Edwards Plateau, and you can see the way in which the rivers flow out of here. And what maps can tell us, they can't tell us everything, but one of the things they can do is orient us in space. They reveal geologically and geographically what a landscape looks like and its differences relative to those that abut it, and that's really crucial. And so we can see the Edwards Plateau. We can't see the aquifer, but we all know that it's buried underneath there. We can't, in this map at least, really see the springs that are the wellspring, quite literally, for the many rivers that flow out of this plateau, cut through the escarpment and head towards the Gulf. But you can sense them. You can see the way in which the map maker in this particular case did this work. And I'm really fascinated by that, in part because it helps us see what other people saw at a different time. And it turns out what we imagine these spaces to look like is really what they were trying to convey to us about the world that they occupied, both politically, and you can see county lines, as well as geologically and geographically. But there's a couple of things that are missing. And that key thing here is how these spaces were lived. What were people's lived experiences of these landscapes? How did those lived experiences change over time, as everything does, but we can't see it in a map because a map is static? How did the hill country become the hill country as opposed to the plateau? Really, people started to use different language to describe that landscape itself. What's the link between that and what we know to be the coastal plain that flows away from it, the riparian landscapes that obviously are so crucial to ranching and other economies in South and Central Texas. And ultimately, because I'm an historian, one of the things that I'm deeply interested in, and the hill country has helped me do this over the many, many years that I've lived in San Antonio and thought deeply about this landscape, is to help us see the changes over time. And one of the ways to do that is to think about the way in which human beings have sort of lived here and have wrestled with some of its central conundrums. The two organizations that are co-hosting this event tonight are focused in on, quite logically, contemporary issues of water and land, pressures of pipelines and overdrafting the aquifer. These are crucial issues to the 21st century of the Edwards Plateau. And I'd like to suggest that, in a way, the questions that they are raising, and they're really crucial questions, environmental, political, social, and economic, have their predecessors back in the day. That is to say, the past is very much present in these contemporary issues, or at least in my imagination, that's true. So let me do this in a couple of ways, and to talk about three central challenges that the Edwards Plateau over time has had to address, or at least the people who live there had to address. And I want to do it by looking at some of the earliest evaluations of these landscapes that are framed around some of their physical characteristics. I absolutely adore this map of the Edwards Plateau, and particularly the Edwards Aquifer and the recharge zones. But what you get in this map are the richness, the real richness of this natural resource. And everywhere is water. Whether you're looking at the dots which identify the springs, or the rivers that flow from them, or the cities through which those rivers go. And please don't miss the fact that we're human settlement, and that goes way back in time to the indigenous people of this region. We all have lived along these riparian landscapes for good reason. Human beings have an affinity for water, in part because we are water, and in part because we can't survive without it. But it does help us understand why populations have settled where they have, and why those populations put pressure on this land that posed many of the challenges that were true in the 18th century and remain true to this day, 400, 300 years plus later. So part of it is to think about that dynamic. Part of it is to see that dynamic in time. And I want to start with this guy, William L. Bray, a botanist working for the U.S. Forest Service in the early part of the 20th century, before, in fact, the U.S. Forest Service, which would be created in 1905, was actually created. He's working for the Department of Agriculture and for its Bureau of Forestry when Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief, hired Bray to go to Central Texas and to provide a report, the first federal funded report about the timber of the Edwards Plateau, which is a pretty banal title because it does a lot more than timber. But Bray who had never been there, Venice is sort of like this really interesting character who starts to roam the Edwards Plateau, cutting up and down the Balcones Escarpment, going to Austin, going to San Antonio, and back up. And what he's doing by this movement is trying to figure out how this geology and the geography of this landscape works within the human economy. In short, he's looking at the land, but he's actually looking at how people are utilizing the land. And I want to set up his final conclusion as a way to open up the conversation. And I use this quote here that he said, one of the central challenges that faces this landscape is how people figure out to build coalitions among different partners who utilize this landscape in very different ways. And so here's this beautiful quote that he says, the future is going to rest with the cattlemen of the plains, the South Central Plains as they flow down towards the Gulf, and the ranchers up in the hills, meaning the hill country, the Edwards Plateau, about whether those pastures will be worn out, whether overgrazings will denude the hills by unwise cutting and overgrazing. In short, what he's looking at is this relationship between upstream and downstream, that if you live up in Fredericksburg, you better be thinking about ranchers who live down in the South Coastal Plain. And those South Coastal Plain better be thinking about that rancher up in Fredericksburg, or otherwise this system isn't going to work effectively for either of them. A way to think about how he was thinking is what I would call a watershed thinking, right? To think like a watershed is to force yourself to see upstream if you're downstream, and downstream if you're upstream, and to recognize that you share certain values. Hence his argument, the future rests with these people about what the land is going to look like. And that tells us that what he's seeing is not necessarily beneficial, that there is environmental damage already taking place that he is warning about and effectively saying, you guys better get in coalition, not unlike GEAA, not unlike TREAD, because that's the way to organize yourselves to ensure that these resources continue to serve your grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So one of the ways then is to go dive deeply into his text. It's actually a pretty short document, but it is packed with information, which is why I want to show you the cover on the one hand. They didn't go slick back in the day, but it does convey what it wants to do, which is this question of climate, water supply, and soil. And that seems like a deep dive, but it turns out Bray, like those who would succeed him, and we'll talk about some of them, recognized that you can't just look at soil, you can't just look at water, you can't just think about climate, you have to look at all of that, and then you have to do the sort of ground truthing as Bray will do. And so again, classic early Forest Service materials not only contain texts, but Gifford Pinchot insisted that anyone who wrote a report for the federal government that he was overseeing in the Bureau of Forestry needed to take photographs, because it was the visual that contained way more information in some cases than the text itself. So let's start with one of Bray's hopeful commentary, which is to look at this hill near Austin, as he said, which was once covered with a pure stand of mountain oak that had been cleared, as the oak would be used for fuel, it would be used for fence posts, it would be used in Austin itself to build housing and the like. And you can see on the right-hand corner, sort of middle screen of this, where the logs have been basically propped up and will ultimately be hauled down to market. Bray's instinct, even though he wasn't there to see this happen, was that although this area was cut clear, it's a clear cut for fuel, you can actually see regeneration taking place, and he believed it would be a rapid renewal of timber. He didn't stick around long enough to figure out that maybe rapid was the wrong text here. But nonetheless, that was part of the assumption that if you got rain, which as we know in South Texas and Central Texas is a big if, but let's say you get it, you can start to regenerate naturally that which you have cut. So he's not terribly upset yet, not terribly worried about what's going on. However, you flip the page and two pages later, he's showing you cedar, a cedar break near Austin, 25 years after the first cutting. So that gets us back into the latter part of the 19th century. and it looks as if it's regenerated. And again, it looks like a sort of natural system that actually works to human advantage. But as he notes, what you used the cedar for was for fuel and charcoal, as well as, again, for fence posts and other material. And then you start to see his text is veering away from the photograph. And so I was looking at it this evening and sort of thinking about how to use this photograph. And even though he says it shows the capacity for reforestation, he actually has in the text a greater worry, which this quote points out. It's probably, he said, that more cedar timber has been burned than marketed, and vastly greater areas denuded by fire than by the axe. And for foresters in the late 19th and early 20th century, this language is code. It's code, whether it was written about the Rockies or the Sierras or the Cascades, or as it turns out, the Edwards Plateau. It was that human consumption was highly exploitative and extractive, and without a sort of conservative approach to this, you might in fact not just denude this landscape, but the reforestation that you hoped would occur may not occur. And why? Because fire may come in and alter the soil characteristics, which would mean a cedar brake that 25 years after recutting, if it was cut, might not work 25 years after a fire. And this is the language that the Forest Service isn't inventing. It's watching all of this take place around the country in its infancy and starting to think about some of the consequences that come from this. And so for Bray, as well as his peers, there was a second concern. What if we did not keep, as with the North Gorge here and Lone Tree Hill, again, close to Austin, and he basically stayed within a 20, 25 mile area of Austin up in the hill country during his trip. What if you don't get the photograph on the left, excuse me, but you get the photograph on the right? And what if, as we also know, in the Edwards Plateau, you get some thunderous storms that blow up, whether it's a hurricane that is slowly rolling through the area and dropping 10 to 20 inches, well, then you have a problem. And the problem is that denuding the timber, taking out all of the timber under an extractive economy, could lead to, and actually always did, huge runoff after a storm. As Bray notes in his text about this, the debate over the economy of the hill country and what could be pulled from it was often cautioned by and sort of controlled by the other desire, as he says here, to see destructive floods prevented. And Austin is a good example of what destructive floods could do. Because periodically in the late 19th and early 20th century, the dams on the Colorado River got so pounded by debris coming down from the hills above it, debris that was a result of clear cutting that wasn't properly logged and maintained. Literally, trees are coming down, rocks and boulders hitting those dams and destroying them twice in the history of those dams, such that the dams then broke and then blew into the smaller town of Austin and devastated it. Bray doesn't know from this yet, but he's worried about what the photograph on the right conveys and knows that the photograph on the left is what you want. You could log in here, but you have to log more carefully than happened. You don't take everything out. You make it possible for the landscape to continue to breathe effectively and do the work that you want it to do, that it provides economic goods on the one hand and environmental, social benefits on the other. But he wasn't seeing it, and that's why he's arguing for, let's call it collaborative conservation. Those cedar choppers up in the hill country need to be thinking, as they're logging heavily, what the impact is going to be on a city like Austin and what the impact will be down the Colorado all the way to the Gulf if one of these surging storms drops an enormous amount of water, generates a flood that's going to carry away not just a dam in Austin, but everything down below it. In short, think like a watershed the moment you put the axe in your hand. It's a hard concept for those on the ground to necessarily understand, but Bray effectively is trying to be a teacher. And it's actually what I love about his project is the way in which he can show us that the impact of human beings on landscapes changes the way those landscapes function, produces damages that we might not have thought about. And effectively, as a future conservation, a guy by the name of Aldo Leopold, whose Sand County Almanac is one of the Bibles of sort of close thinking about land and people's relationship to it. He said, a conservationist is a person with an axe in hand who thinks about what that axe is going to do before they do it. I love that metaphor. I love that image. And it's actually an image that Bray is arguing for in 1904, 40 years before Leopold penned those words. Bray's report, I suspect, was not read widely. I was thrilled to find it and to read it. And I actually found it because I read a subsequent report about the exact same hill country with many of the same arguments written by another Forest Service employee, W.W. Ash, who, like Bray, was a botanist, like Bray, was deeply interested in the relationship between upstream and downstream, who advocated for watershed thinking and landscape scale management. But what's intriguing about Ash is, unlike Bray, who didn't see a flood, Ash did. He was brought to Central Texas by the State Water Board that wanted to know what Ash knew about watershed thinking, because Ash, since the latter part of the 19th century, had been working on these issues all over the United States at the behest of the Forest Service. He actually, as a young man, had worked with a young man, Gifford Pinchot, in North Carolina for the geology department of the state. And I've read their document, which is this stunning piece of work in the early 1890s. And in the early 1890s, they're looking at western part of North Carolina and looking at the seasonal heavy rains that ripped down heavily logged areas, produced vast flooding along the French Ford, the French Broad River, and others near Asheville. And it's basically the same argument Ash will use about the Colorado, the San Antonio River, the Guadalupe, and others in Central Texas. 30 years earlier, he saw the kind of damage that could happen. So the State Water Board brought him in late August 1921 to Central Texas and basically asked him to sort of roam around the hill country and tell them how to better manage for water supply, for reservoirs, for dams, for hydropower, and flood protection. And Ash had this history within the Forest Service and on his own work of being this incredibly close reader of landscapes. You may know the ash juniper. It's named for him because he was the first person to identify that major tree in Central Texas up in the plateau as being a distinct species. So, and so he's figuring this stuff out. Even, I mean, he botanized like crazy, but he's also using botany as a way to signal what were larger landscape scale problems. So he's roaming around Central Texas. He comes down to San Antonio for kind of a breather on September 9th, 1921. And that night, the city got hit, as did Austin, as did New Braunfels, as did San Marcos, Thrall, and a bunch of other cities, with a hurricane that sort of wandered off of the Gulf Coast, arced along the Balcones Escarpment, basically using the Edwards Plateau as a kind of pivot. And that storm pivoted along that area and dropped enormous amounts of rain. Just to the north of Olmos Creek in San Antonio, they were measuring 17 to 18 inches in a couple of hours, which is an astonishing amount of water in a very short period of time. That water went careening down the Olmos Creek, slammed into the San Antonio River, and then inundated downtown. You can see the US Army here that next morning, the September 10th, rowing down Houston, St. Mary Street in this case, but also on Houston Street and elsewhere. on the west side of San Antonio, all of the west side creeks blew out of their banks at midnight, never a good time for a flood, and just ripped through the barrio, killing more than 80 people in the city, almost all of whom were Hispanic or Hispanic surnamed. And it was a devastating flood. And by chance, Ash was there, watching exactly what he would ultimately predict in his own report about what was taking place in the Central Texas Valley, in the Central Texas, the plateau and escarpment, and the downstream cities. And what's interesting for me is that fortunately, a San Antonio Express reporter had heard that he had been in town, had heard that he was a watershed expert, and so in fact sought him out for an interview and finally caught up with him in Austin, where he was about to speak to the State Water Board, and said, okay, what's going on here? Tell me what's going on. And in an interview that was on the front page of the San Antonio Express, Ash laid it out. He told San Antonio readers, and presumably said the same thing to the State Water Board, that Central Texas had a serious problem. And it wasn't just that floods repeatedly had washed through the city, which was true. The problem Ash identified was that no one was thinking upstream, downstream. No one in Austin, no one in San Antonio had made the connection that heavy ranching, heavy logging in the cedar breaks and the oak trees, that sort of trampling as only cattle can do, really hammering the ground into almost a hardened surface, would have permanent impact on downstream communities, so that when they got hit with 20 inches of rain, that water is going to hit that ground and move like a rocket downhill. And it didn't matter what you might put up, a dam in Austin or check dams in San Antonio. If you didn't protect upstream, you were going to get clobbered downstream. So part of his sort of analysis was that people weren't thinking large enough. And San Antonio wasn't, because the same day his interview appeared on the front page of the city's major newspaper, the San Antonio Express. That same newspaper, like all of the other newspapers in town, were demanding a dam, now called the Olmos Dam, that would protect the city permanently from flood damage. Well, all they talked about was the dam. They never had a concept, even though they could have read it on page 1 as well, that they had to think about the landscape north of the dam, which is the same question that one could have asked about Austin. Sure, you got a dam. What does the land look like north of you? And so Bray and Ash are sounding warnings to Texans in the early part of the 20th century that you needed to think in long-term scales. You needed to think like a conservationist. And so the quote here from Ash in his interview in the Express News says this in multiple ways: to secure a permanency of water storage, and that was more true of the Colorado River than the San Antonio River, you have to reduce soil erosion to a minimum, he said. And the way to do that is to secure forest cover. So when you log carefully, knowing that in the gorges, along the floodplains and the mountain slopes and the ravines, if you take everything, you've got no natural protection for the floods that will scream down these ravines and into the cities that lie to the south and east of them. That was a consequence of logging, but it was also a consequence, as he said, of keeping good soil cover on the range. So the grasslands had been mowed down just as the cedar breaks and oak forest had been mowed down. And you can't do that without suffering the consequences. So in 1904, Bray made that claim. Ash, who read Bray's report, reiterates the report and then adds his own expertise, which, as someone who had been studying floods and flood control for now 30 years before he arrived in San Antonio, came at it as an interestingly interdisciplinary approach, because he basically, in his conversation with the State Water Board, said, look, you guys are engineers. I'm a forester. We have got to collaborate on this process, because if you simply build dams, you're not going to survive. Those dams will give way at some point when logs and debris come crashing down. And so in effect, if you want benefits, you've got to think about the environment as an environment, which is a really crucial concept in this early stage of the state's development. What neither Ash nor Bray could anticipate was that the Edwards Plateau would in time become one of the heaviest concentrations of sheep, goat, and cattle in the state, and that would have a major impact on the future of that land as a landscape, and would have ultimately some challenges as well. So in 1932, yet another economist shows up in the region, a man by the name of William M. Chambers, who wrote a really good piece in 1932 in Economic Geography, thinking about ranching in this area just as the Depression hit. He's up in that landscape thinking about its future. And he too has this wonderful map. He lays out places and the connections to rivers as one would do, but he is thinking about the Edwards as a zone, as an economic geography, as a place where, as he said, combination ranching, what we would call diversified ranching. So you're using different animals and also using logs and other things to sort of diversify your economic activity. Combination ranching will become more intense as time passes. And why is that? Because the value of the land is going to increase. And the use of capital equipment. So if we think about agriculture, for example, and the use of tractors and the like, that's going to cost more money. So to get that money, you have to diversify your economy, but that means that what's coming off of this plateau is more valued in Del Rio, more valued in San Antonio and Austin. And the land, therefore, because the demand for your products increases, the land itself is going to cost more. And that's going to force ranchers, as well as those who are logging, to act in certain ways to increase the capacity to be more productive in this terrain. Bray, it seems to me, was spot on in terms of the pressures on the land, but the pressures that he imagined in 1932 were nothing compared to the pressures that would come in succeeding generations, succeeding decades. So I've pulled series of data about sheep and goat, because what happened in the central part of the Edwards Plateau, which neither Bray nor Ash nor Chambers could have anticipated, was the concentration of sheep and goat in this region. And so if you look at the numbers on the left-hand side of sheep, by 1943, there's close to 11 million head of sheep in the Edwards Plateau. If you look at goats, by 1963, there's about 4.6 million. And much of this growth had to do particularly with sheep, and 43 is a point to make here, with the incentives that the federal government is giving through subsidies. The market for wool in terms of the war was off the chain, massive in that way. And so the signals for those who had raised sheep is raise more sheep. The signals for those who were raising goat and mohair in particular, because that went into flight jackets and the like, was to raise more goats and to move that into San Antonio and Austin and elsewhere to get it into the national economy, which boomed those economies, to be sure, but which had immense consequences for the land itself. Put 10 million sheep and thousands upon thousands of goat, and then add cattle into this mix, and you recognize that the grasslands in the upper part of the Edwards Plateau just got mowed down. The decline is important as well, because that sends a different set of signals. The subsidies disappeared. The land's deterioration was so great that you could not do what you had once done. And so we see the decline by 2000 in terms of the number of goat and sheep. But it still remains, if maybe not quite the world capital of natural fiber as it was in the 1950s and 60s, still a significant player in the production a fiber for the world's economy. But as I say, the environmental downstream consequences were intense, and that's part of what Bray and Ash, and to a degree, Chambers also anticipated, that you could not simply extract goods and services from these landscapes without thinking about the consequences. A set of questions that, frankly, in our own day, matter enormously. So let's come back to another map of the Edwards Aquifer and think about the lands that overlie that recharge zone and the aquifer as this remarkable natural system. And note, in parallel to the decline in the number of sheep and goat, and thus the amount of ranching that was possible, a couple of things. The graph on the right-hand side shows us the decline in acreage that was attributed back in the day, slowly from the 1990s through 2012. That loss can be identified in a couple of ways, one of which is the market is collapsing, so you stop using it for these kinds of activities. Note two, as the graph suggests, that the average land ownership side decreased. It only looks like a little, but actually a little is a lot in this case. And the total number of farms thus increased, but their average size has decreased. And so something interesting is going on. And part of what that is going on across the 90s through the middle part of the 20-teens is that there were different kinds of pressures now working their way upstream into the Central Plateau, crossing the Belconas Escarpment and moving into the agricultural land. And so I'm grateful to Annalisa for getting me this slide. We know that in the last decade, this slide would look even worse, if worse is the right word for it, but it follows US 281 and moves its way out of San Antonio, going north into the hill country. And you can see development in 1973 in the yellow. You can see the even greater development and the massive takeover of this land for housing by 2009, which is about the time I left San Antonio. And part of what you're seeing is that the maps actually can't keep up with the development that was happening. I remember in the early 90s, an episode of fire erupting in a new subdivision in San Antonio, and the firefighters couldn't find it because it was off their map. And this is pre-Google. You couldn't quite do what we can do now. And so there was this sort of puzzling, but obviously really crucial notion that so much growth was going on off of 281. And if we had a map for it, Interstate 10 as it arcs through Fredericksburg or close to Fredericksburg. So much development was happening that public services couldn't keep up with the transition, which is a little scary when you think about a house on fire, that the fire department can't find you unless they've got really good ways of sort of tracking the smoke plume. But from our vantage point, given what Bray and Ash and Chambers identified in the first 30 years of the 20th century, we're now looking at a very different developmental pattern that's not coming from the upstream to the downstream, but is actually flipping that process as San Antonio, New Braunfels, San Marcos, and Austin and elsewhere penetrate the hill country and move up off of the major arterials to begin to purchase land. And so part of the answer to why agricultural lands are taken out of production is, in fact, they've been converted to housing developments. Part of it is that some of these housing developments aren't ranches, they're ranchettes, which is shrinking the average size of these landscapes and may become second homes for folks in Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, and the like. Lots of different things are happening, but one crucial thing is occurring, which is the moment you move subdivisions in, you concretize the landscape. You have impermeable rooftops, please, because who wants a leaking roof? You have gutters that capture water. Those gutters lead to driveways that are concretized. Those driveways lead to curbs that lead to channels that take the water away from the recharge zone and sluice it down channels, down flood-controlled channels and then shoot them down through the rivers so that they never penetrate the hill country itself, which means that we're losing water because we were building permeable surfaces on this landscape. And that's but one of many integrated problems. The other thing that we can see, and again, I'm thankful to realtors who have the San Antonio Board of Realtors that provided this slide, because you literally see the transition from places like Bulverde Hills and Saddle Ridge into subdivisions, the John Ranch lots, the McCarty Ranch lots. All of these ranches are being converted, and this is up through 2020, being taken over by, if you look on the outside of this area, by housing that is going to look exactly like the housing inside these ranches that have 400 lots, 900 lots, 1,800 lots. We are looking at thousands of new homes. And let's say each household has 3 or more people in it. We're now looking at an enormous density. This is not sort of, this is sprawl, but it's a different kind of sprawl. And like Los Angeles, which is incredibly dense, we are now not just having small houses separated by large lots. These are incredibly dense developments, as the photograph on the left hand demonstrates. And even though, and let's take the subdivisions on the left here as an example, even though they are controlling for drainage so that you can actually, maybe, given the spacing of where this is, put water back into the Edwards Aquifer. Note what's coming off of these households. As their roofs catch it, as their streets catch it, that water is not quite the pristine rainwater it might have been before it hit that area, because it's going to pick up gasoline, it's going to pick up oil, it's going to pick up heavy metals that our cars discharge and flush them into these stream beds. And if it doesn't go to the Edwards Plateau aquifer, that actually is maybe a good thing. But even if it does, it then has other consequences in terms of water quality and the like, in terms of how we're going to have to filter this. The final thing I would point out, and here is a perfect example of it, look at the roads. Because the only way to get to these places is through cars. And so, as beautiful as they once were, they're going to be differently beautiful, I suspect, to those who buy them, who will then get down onto 281 and work their way to San Antonio or wherever they're going. And so some of what we're looking at is the conversion of land to housing. Some of it is the number of cars and the air pollution that those cars are going to create, that is going to create a separate problem, but it's not separate. It's actually integral to this new suburban subdivision that's going to pose other dilemmas. Not just water quality, but air quality is going to be damaged by this process. And so we're taking the contemporary city and tossing it into the hill country. And again, my interrogators from the early 20th century, they had no idea what was coming. But it's actually the same problem. Because to put this housing here is to pose downhill consequences that are pretty obvious in some ways, because how else are we going to drive this economy, literally drive it, but through, at the moment, fossil fuels? And where is that fossil fuel going to be coming from? Well, in Texas and other places, those pipelines coming from the Permian Basin have to go somewhere. If they're going to get to the refineries, if they're going to get to our gas tanks, if they're going to get into our cars and our trucks and our pickups and the like, they're going to lay those pipelines down. And what TRED and GEAA are working on is trying to figure out, wait, how do we slow this process down? Because look at where the pipeline goes. And again, I love this map because it's a baseline map that tells us the same set of problems. There are the rivers. There are the springs that create those rivers, signaling the aquifer beneath. And there's the pipeline. Any spill from that pipeline is going to immediately be absorbed if it's not captured, and that's going to be tough. into that watershed itself, to pollute the very thing that makes it possible for people to live up and down in the spring line cities, as they're known, from Austin south through San Antonio and Del Rio and elsewhere. What we are doing is perfectly understandable. We need that fossil fuel because otherwise we can't move our economy. But that comes at a cost for the other thing we absolutely must have, which is clear water. And so again, the intention and the attention to this process poses a set of dilemmas that Bray anticipated. And what Bray's conclusion was is actually the conclusion that I think GEAA and TREAD are also working on, which is that you've got to think every step of the way about how we use spaces like this area and what the downstream consequences will be. And the key, as Bray said, and as W.W. Ash said, was that there has to be coalitions. And what I love about GEAA and TREAD is the two words that end them. One's an alliance and the other is a coalition. And it has to be collaborative because these are big spaces on the one hand, but they are spaces that require a multiplicity of stakeholders who think that a pipeline may not be the best thing for a region that is so dependent upon this natural resource, the Edwards Aquifer, which is exactly what Bray said, which is exactly what Ash said. They just said it in a different context. And it's exactly what's going on in Virginia right now with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which may have been stalled finally because the stakeholder coalitions were able to block it. It's exactly what indigenous people on the Northern Plains with the Dakota Access Pipeline argued. It's exactly what lots of other people argued about the Keystone Pipeline and pipelines everywhere. It's not that the pipeline necessarily is a bad thing, but if it's placed in areas that are so crucial to the survival of millions of people, then frankly, it is a bad thing. And the way to shift that dynamic can only be through the kind of political will that grassroots organizations in coalition with other grassroots organizations can rise up to protect the Edwards Plateau and the Trinity Aquifer and the Edwards Aquifer, obviously, because these systems predicated on springs and rivers that make Central Texas such a gorgeous place to live is also why it's an important role to play, that these organizations have an important role to play to protect the very beauty of these landscapes and the lives that they have given to so many for so long. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Char. That was excellent.
My pleasure. That was great. That was fun.
I'm just thinking of all the other folks I'm going to send this to. This is really, really excellent. I can't thank you enough.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. It was fun, at least in the imagination, to get back to Central Texas. I miss it terribly.
Well, we miss you too.
Yeah, well, that was wonderful. And truly, you know, not just with the pipeline routing, because that's such a crucial issue, but just as Texas grows and changes and we see so many people moving to this state every day, that we are thoughtful about our developments and the urban encroachment onto the rural and how we navigate some of those things.
Yes.
And like you were mentioning about like the rural, you know, the ranches kind of being subdivided, we're seeing a lot of that in the hill country. And, you know, we want industry and commerce and growth, but it's a matter of making sure that we're all working in concert with each other to make sure that we are thoughtful about all of our resources and we steward our land and those resources properly. So that was a fantastic talk. I'm thrilled that you did that.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm serving on the regional flood planning group for the Guadalupe, and I will be sending this to all my fellow stakeholders on that group because we've really been advocating land preservation, and it was like, bingo, thank you, Char.
Yep. I mean, because you guys are both thinking in different ways because you have different organizations, but you're thinking landscape scale, right? And that's the language, right? It's not simply local. It can't be just local. It's got to be much bigger than that. Because look at the Edwards Plateau. I mean, that thing is massive. And you've really got to think about, and I'm you know, sort of mansplaining here, but because you guys know this, but like you have got to think out as big as the landscape is, or otherwise you can't do it. And that's what leads to these coalitions, which I'm really excited to see.
Yes. Well, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We had a wonderful turnout. We are also streaming on Facebook Live. So know that the TRED Talk has been recorded and will be accessible after the fact, and you can always find it on TRED's Facebook page. Char, thank you so much for a great presentation.
My pleasure.
And Annalisa, thank you so much for co-hosting this with us tonight. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, comments, need additional information. I can be reached at info@treadcoalition.org, and we will be having more of these discussions as land use and, quite frankly, water are hot button issues, not only in the upcoming legislative session next year, but as I mentioned, as Texas grows and changes. So we look forward to maybe more presentations with you, Char, and definitely working
Anytime.
with the Greater Edwards Aquifer Alliance. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a great week.
You too. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.